You smell iron before you see it. Not the kind from swords or chains, but the thick, sour scent of blood soaking into cobblestones that were never meant to hold this much death. It clings to your throat like smoke. Heavy. Metallic. Ancient. The sky overhead is a bruised gray, the color of breath held too long. Bells are ringing, not in harmony, but in hysteria, their clangs warped by distance and the screams that ricochet off the stone walls around you. Somewhere a child is crying, or laughing, you can't tell which. Your shoes are wet. You look down. It isn't water. You're standing in the middle of a street in Paris, but this is not the Paris of poets and palaces. This is the Paris that poets will one day try to forget. The gutters overflow with filth and fragments of something far worse. The mob is moving. Not walking. Not marching. Swarming, like a fever with legs. And at the center of it, like a crown on a rotting corpse, there is a head. Mounted high above the chaos. Lips parted. Eyes wide open. They've powdered her face. They've styled her hair. They've painted rouge on her cheeks, as if she were attending a ball. Only she has no body. Someone, you don't know who, lifts the pike higher, and the crowd roars. A sea of hands and fists and bloodied fingers wave as if welcoming royalty, as if this grotesque trophy were something to honor, not mourn. You want to look away. You don't. Because something holds you. Not the gore. Not the horror. But the echo. She was screaming. Not in pain. Not in fear. But a name. A name she would not betray. Over and over, even as they ripped the last threads of clothing from her skin, even as they beat her with bottles, fists, boots. Even as they pulled her apart. That name, it hangs in the air like a ghost. It's been hours. Maybe days. Still, you hear it. Not from her lips, they're long gone. But from the crowd. From the stones. From the pike itself. It is a name whispered with venom, with worship, with warning. And for just a moment, the spectacle feels less like punishment and more like ritual. Less like justice and more like revenge. Not for who she was. But for who she loved. The mob doesn't chant for freedom today. They chant for blood. And they chant to be seen, to make sure the woman locked behind those prison walls, the woman for whom this head once smiled, hears them. You try to speak, but the breath sticks in your lungs. Because you finally understand, this wasn't an execution. It was a message. Painted in blood, delivered on a pike, sent straight to the soul of a queen. And now the mob turns. The head still smiles. And the eyes, those terrible, glassy, frozen eyes, they seem to find you. As if asking, will you look away too? You try to tear your eyes away, but something inside you whispers to look deeper. Past the blood. Past the horror. Past the pike. If you listen long enough, if you stand still beneath the weight of that severed gaze, you begin to feel it, the reason she died. And it wasn't treason. It wasn't monarchy. It wasn't wealth. It was love. Not the romantic kind. Not the kind that burns in letters or ends in bedchambers. This was something colder. Older. Sharper. A friendship so absolute that it became dangerous. Years before her head became a symbol, she had another name. And it passed between palace walls in hushed reverence and veiled contempt. She arrived at court draped in mourning, her young husband already dead, her heart cracked in half before the age of 20. But it was her silence that unsettled people most. She was soft-spoken, gracious, and heartbreakingly beautiful in a way that seemed untouched by time. Marie Antoinette noticed her first. The young Dauphine, foreign-born, isolated, and drowning in the brutal etiquette of Versailles. Surrounded by spies and serpents dressed as courtiers, she found something in the widow that she had never encountered at court, safety. It began with glances. Then long walks through gilded gardens. Whispers behind closed doors. And then, letters. They called each other by secret names. They wrote in flourishes of affection too intimate for public display. They exchanged perfumes and relics and small pressed violets. Marie had many companions, but this one was different. She called her, the only heart I trust in France. The princess was elevated, granted the unheard-of role of superintendent of the queen's household, a title carved out of thin air, dripping with salary and power. For a woman. At court. It was scandal. The whispers came first. How could a widow who barely spoke above a murmur hold such sway over the Queen of France? Was she her confidante, or her puppet master? Were they bound by sisterhood, or something darker? Every gesture was examined. Every closeness, exaggerated. The way their hands lingered. The way they sat too near, too long. Versailles has always been a palace of glass where privacy is an illusion. And in that fishbowl, their bond became poison. Pamphlets began to circulate in the streets. Caricatures of them drawn in positions too obscene to speak aloud. Rumors bloomed like rot in the gutters, that the queen was bewitched, seduced, corrupted by this foreign-born widow with too pale skin and too soft eyes. The princess said nothing. Always nothing. That was her gift. Silence as armor. Loyalty as shield. But in revolutionary France, silence could be mistaken for superiority. And loyalty, for treason. Because while the queen spent, and the country starved, the people asked, who whispers in her ear at night? Who props her up when the crown feels heavy? Who feeds her defiance? They didn't just hate the aristocracy. They hated the intimacy. The unbreakable tether between two women who seemed untouchable. And in their eyes, the one who needed to die first was not the queen. It was her mirror. The one who reminded her she was still human. The one who never left her side. The one who, when the palace fell, chose chains over escape. She could have fled. She had the titles. The bloodlines. The invitations from foreign courts. But she stayed. Because of a promise. Because of love. Because the queen, now a prisoner, whispered her name in the dark. And she answered. Not with speeches. Not with rage. Just presence. Just being there. And that, in a time of war and revolution, was the most dangerous weapon of all. They say she stood calm when the mobs screamed her name. That she prayed while others begged. That she never once uttered a word against the queen. Not one. And that silence sealed her fate. Because in a world collapsing under suspicion and fury, nothing is more threatening than unwavering loyalty. She chose death over betrayal. And you're still debating whether to subscribe? Think about that. She was born under the weight of gold, into the House of Savoy, a lineage stitched into the very fabric of Europe's noble blood. A name that echoed in the halls of Turin and the courts of Vienna. A name that came with expectations, with pressure, with duty. From the moment she took her first breath, her life was not her own. It belonged to the alliances her womb might forge, to the power her silence might protect, and to the image her posture projected in a ballroom full of teeth disguised as smiles. She was delicate, but not weak. Quiet, but not simple. The kind of girl taught never to speak above a whisper unless spoken to, yet capable of absorbing the room like a sponge soaks water, passively at first, but completely in the end. At 17, she was promised, no, traded, to Prince Louis Alexander de Bourbon, heir to one of France's richest houses and a cousin to the king himself. The match was brilliant on paper. But paper cannot smell. Paper cannot bleed. He was a man of disease and appetite. A syphilitic noble who stank of wine, perfume, and other women. He gambled like a god and sinned like a beast. To the court, he was charming. To her, he was a sentence. Within a year, he was dead. Perhaps by poison, perhaps by illness, perhaps by his own unchecked lusts. No one mourned. Least of all the girl who had been his bride. And when the black veil fell over her hair, she wore it not as grief, but as freedom. She was 18. A widow. Untouched by love. Uninterested in remarriage. In a world where a woman's value began and ended with whose bed she warmed, this was her first act of rebellion. She never remarried. And France never forgave her for it. They called her cold. They called her unnatural. They whispered that she preferred the company of women, of servants, of the queen. That she prayed too much, smiled too little, and listened too well. Aristocracy was a cage, but she refused to pace like the other birds. Instead, she stood still. Dignified. Untouched. When Marie Antoinette took the throne, she reached for her. Not for her beauty or her blood, but for her steadiness. Her silence. Her incorruptible gaze. She made her superintendent of the Queen's household, a position of immense trust, influence, and proximity. It was a role that hadn't existed before. A title conjured from nothing for one woman alone. And that, in Versailles, was heresy. The salary was obscene. The authority unthinkable. And the proximity to the Queen. Dangerous. Pamphlets began to multiply like vermin in the alleys of Paris. Broad sheets inked in bile. They didn't call her by name, at first. Just, the widow. The whisperer. The shadow at the Queen's table. But it didn't take long. They said she controlled the Queen. Said she poisoned her mind with foreign sympathy and private secrets. Said the two women spent too many hours behind closed doors, that no husband or priest could know what passed between them. That her presence was a sickness spreading from throne to chambermaid to citizen. Drawings appeared, crude, pornographic, violent. They depicted her feeding Marie Antoinette grapes from her mouth. They showed bedsheets soaked in sweat and sin. And though the nobility scoffed in public, they stared too long in private. She said nothing. That was her way. But the silence only fed the flames. Because silence, in the court of public opinion, is guilt. Silence is conspiracy. Silence is femininity weaponized. A woman who speaks is shrill. A woman who's silent. Dangerous. And she was dangerous, not because of what she did, but because of what she refused to be. She never cried in public. Never lost her temper. Never chased after approval. That terrified them more than treason. And so, the stories kept spreading. She had bewitched the Queen. She controlled the palace. She was the true ruler of France. All lies. But lies well told grow roots. And by the time revolution hung in the air like a storm cloud, the name Princess de Lamballe was soaked in controversy, in seduction, in suspicion. She was no longer seen as a grieving widow or a loyal friend. She was a symbol. A threat. An easy target. Because to the mobs gathering in the cafés and gutters of Paris, she was everything they had grown to hate. She was born rich. She refused men. She had the Queen's ear. And she said nothing to defend herself. They filled the silence with bile. And she let them. Because she understood something they didn't. You don't fight filth by rolling in it. You stand still, and let the filth reveal itself. She thought that would be enough. She was wrong. The truth is, she never had a chance. Because women like her are not allowed to exist quietly. Not in a world that punishes independence with suspicion, and loyalty with death. And still, she never looked away. She never spoke out. She simply stood beside her friend, every day, as the world prepared to burn. She endured the whispers, the venom, the grotesque drawings passed like gossip between pages. Because what they said in ink never mattered. What mattered was what she never said. She never betrayed. She never begged. She never let them make her small. Even as the news tightened, even as the mobs grew louder, she remained what she had always been, a woman they could not understand. And because they could not understand her, they chose to destroy her. But before they did, before they dragged her into the blood-stained streets of Paris, they had to convince themselves she deserved it. So they printed another pamphlet. And another. And another. Until her silence screamed louder than any confession. They poisoned her name long before they spilled her blood. And still, she chose death over betrayal. And you're still sitting there, deciding if this story is worth your subscription? She walked to the slaughterhouse with dignity. Surely, you can lift a finger. Or don't. But at least have the courage to explain yourself in the comments. There's a sound that comes before revolution. It's not the roar of a mob or the crack of muskets. It's softer. Slower. It starts as whispers behind lace fans. Jokes at salons. Scribbles in the margins of broadsheets passed from gloved hand to gloved hand. A change in the eyes of servants who stop lowering their gaze. A tension in the air thick as storm clouds. You feel it in Versailles first. Not in the throne room, but in the kitchens. Not in the court balls, but in the rustle of unpaid bills. By the time 1789 arrives, France is no longer a kingdom. It's a kettle. And it's about to scream. The Bastille doesn't fall in a day. It falls in the hearts of men long before its stones are pulled down. Starvation walks arm in arm with fury. Grain prices rise. Wages collapse. Mothers boil weeds for soup. Fathers sell their boots. Children forget the taste of sweetness. And through it all, there is the Queen, Marie Antoinette, with her powdered face and foreign name. And beside her, like a phantom in velvet, the Princess de Lamballe. Two women draped in silk while the city bleeds. At least, that's how the papers tell it. But there is another truth. A quieter one. Behind palace walls, the Queen weeps for her children. She fears for her people. She begs her husband to listen. And the princess? She stands beside her. Not with jewels. Not with laughter. But with silence. She listens when no one else does. She holds the Queen's hand when no man will. She tells the truth, even when it's unwelcome. And to the Queen, she becomes something more than a confidante. She becomes a spine. The pamphlets don't show that. Because that image is too strong. Too threatening. Instead, they draw her differently. They give her fangs. A forked tongue. They paint her with breasts bared, lips curled, coiled around the Queen like a serpent. One cartoon shows her whispering into Marie Antoinette's ear while France crumbles beneath their feet. Another shows her nursing the Queen like a wet nurse, fusing them into one monstrous creature. The seductress. The corrupter. The puppet master. They call her the foreign ghost. The Austrian's mirror. The Queen's true husband. She says nothing. Because anything she says will be twisted. Because every word from her mouth will become another weapon forged in the fire of public rage. And so she watches the tide rise. She watches the Bastille crumble. She watches the king cower. She watches the mob come closer, inch by inch, breath by breath. And still, she does not move. Then, on October 5, 1789, they come. Women. Thousands of them. Marching from Paris to Versailles. Banging pots. Holding pitchforks. Their feet blistered. Their mouths full of chants. Bread. Bread, they scream. But underneath that hunger, there is another appetite. They want to see her. Not the queen. Her. The quiet one. The shadow at the queen's side. The one who never smiles when they mock her. The one who doesn't run. The palace guards are torn apart. Chambers are stormed. Blood stains the marble. And in the chaos, Marie Antoinette flees to the king's room. But the princess doesn't run. She waits. As always. And when they find her, they hesitate. Because she doesn't flinch. Because her stillness is unnerving. Because monsters aren't supposed to be beautiful. They don't kill her that night. Not yet. But they mark her. In whispers. In slogans. In the way they twist her image into something grotesque. Because the truth is simple. They needed someone to blame. Someone to point to and say. That one. That woman is why your child is starving. That woman is why the queen has not changed. That woman is why France burns. She becomes the scapegoat. Not for what she did, but for who she stood beside. She could have left then. Others did. She had letters from Austria, from England, from Italy. Escape routes. Protection. A single carriage could have taken her away. But she stayed. And every day she remained, her image grew darker in the eyes of the people. No longer a princess. No longer a widow. No longer even human. She became the vessel of their rage. A symbol of the old world. A body they could tear to prove they were free. They twisted her image to justify killing her. And if you stay silent now, by not liking, not commenting, aren't you just letting history repeat? She could have left. The roads out of Paris were dangerous, yes, but not impassable. The same wagons that carried frightened nobles to the borders of Austria and Spain could have carried her too. Her name was known across Europe. Her bloodline a key to safety. There were letters from cousins, invitations from exiled courts, offers of sanctuary whispered in drawing rooms and sealed with royal wax. But she stayed. Not out of foolishness. Not out of pride. She stayed because of faith. Not just in God. But in order. In friendship. In the belief that loyalty meant something even when the world was cracking open. And in that loyalty, she found religion. It is 1791. The royal family is restless. The court is no longer a palace, but a cage. The queen weeps in private. The king paces in silence. Their children ask questions no parent should have to answer. And then, the attempt. The flight to Varennes. A night coach. Disguises. Documents. A plan whispered through locked doors and rehearsed behind drawn curtains. They flee. She is not with them. They do not tell her. Perhaps to protect her. Perhaps because they know she would have followed, no matter the risk. But they are caught. Of course they are. A king does not go unnoticed. A queen cannot hide her posture. The people drag them back, not with swords, but with eyes. And Versailles is no more. It is in this moment, when escape has failed, when even the monarchy is on its knees, that most of the queen's inner circle scatter like frightened birds. Dukes. Ladies. Pages. Gone. But not her. She comes to the queen. In broad daylight. Through streets slick with fear and contempt. She comes not to beg for favors or to scheme in shadows. She comes simply to stand beside her. And the guards let her pass. Not because they respect her. But because they believe she is walking into her own execution. They are not wrong. Still, she remains. Why? Because in her mind, there is no choice. She writes in her journal, I shall not forsake Her Majesty. God will not allow them to touch me. He knows I am innocent. She writes it again. And again. She spends hours in prayer. The chapel becomes her refuge. She kneels so long her knees bruise. She whispers psalms like armor, each syllable a shield. In her cell, she sings hymns under her breath. Not to pass the time. Not to comfort others. But because she believes they are listening. Not the guards. Not the people. Heaven. God, she believes, is watching. And if he sees her devotion, he will intervene. This is not pride. This is not fantasy. This is faith, sharpened to a blade. This is the kind of belief that lives in saints and martyrs. And it is beautiful. And it is terrifying. Because what happens when the silence from heaven becomes unbearable? What happens when the mob arrives, and no angels descend? She writes of dreams. Of fire. Of a woman in white walking barefoot through a city drenched in blood. Of bells ringing with no one to pull the rope. Of hands reaching for her, not to hurt her, but to silence her. And still, she does not leave. A cousin writes again. Offers her passage to Naples. Another to Turin. Safe houses. Ships. Secret routes. She thanks them. She burns the letters. She stays. Because to flee would be to admit defeat. To abandon Marie would be to break the sacred bond they shared. To save her life would mean forfeiting her soul. So she stands in rooms where the furniture has been stripped. She walks corridors that once shimmered with chandeliers and now reek of mildew and fear. She holds the queen's hand as guards shout obscenities and spit on the floor. She combs the queen's hair as rats scurry along the walls. She believes her suffering is part of a plan. That perhaps her endurance will buy grace. That perhaps her pain is currency in the court of God. She is not naive. She sees the faces of her captors. She hears the threats. She reads the graffiti on the walls. But she refuses to see them as final. Because the final word, to her, belongs to heaven. And so the days pass. And the prayers deepen. And the letters stop coming. And the footsteps outside her cell grow heavier. And still she whispers, God will not allow them to touch me. But even God, if he hears her, remains silent. And outside, the crowds are not praying. They are sharpening knives. Faith can be armor. Faith can be light. But faith can also be a mirror. Reflecting not salvation, but your own undoing. And sometimes, when the darkness comes for you, it does not ask what you believe. It only asks if you are still breathing. You may call it delusion. You may call it holiness. But either way, it kept her in France. And that faith, flawed, ferocious, unshakable, would walk beside her all the way to the pike. She prayed. She stayed. She died. Because she believed something greater was watching. But now, you're watching. She had faith that someone, someday, would see. So if you're still sitting there, silent, unmoved, if you won't even click, or comment, then tell me, was her death in vain? Or are you just waiting for someone else to care first? The walls were too close. Not in inches, there was space enough to breathe, but in the way they leaned in, heavy with damp rot and centuries of secrets. La Force prison didn't need to be small to feel suffocating. The air was thick. Not just with mold and filth, but with fear that sweated from the stones themselves. She had entered under escort. Not as a prisoner of war. Not as a criminal. But as something else, an object. A trophy. A message waiting to be carved into flesh. 13 days. That's all she was given. 13 days of darkness that stretched like a noose tightening hour by hour. They threw her in with the others, thieves, prostitutes, mad women, murderers. The cell reeked of waste and skin. Iron rusted into every corner. One woman screamed through the night, chasing ghosts no one could see. Another laughed until her teeth bled. And in the middle of it all, she stood, silent. She didn't sit. Not at first. She stood. Even as her legs trembled. Even as her stomach turned from the stench. Because sitting meant surrender. And she had not come to surrender. The guards knew her name. Of course they did. She was the queen's shadow, the whisperer behind the throne. But here, she was just the aristocrat. And they treated her accordingly. They spat when they brought her stale bread. They called her whore of Austria. Leech. Puppet. One guard grabbed her chin and tilted her face toward the torchlight just to spit in her eye. She didn't blink. They smeared feces on her cell wall and wrote her name in it. She kept praying. They banged pots outside her door at night. They screamed her crimes through the bars. Fabricated charges of incest, of sedition, of witchcraft. They brought her lists to sign, blank at the top, hoping she would write the queen's name. She refused. They told her they'd spare her if she spoke against Marie. She didn't. They said they'd parade her through Paris if she lied just once. She stayed quiet. Silence was her defiance. Her final weapon. Because she knew her words no longer mattered. They would twist them. Feed them to the mob in pieces. So she gave them nothing. And nothing, in that prison, was unbearable. Because she didn't scream. She didn't weep. She didn't curse. She prayed. She whispered her rosary while rats chewed through the straw. She shared her food with a child who wasn't hers. She sat with a dying woman who hadn't bathed in weeks, held her hand, and told her she would see her mother soon. She wore her suffering like a second skin. They took her comb. She braided her hair with her fingers. They took her blanket. She slept on stone. They took her dignity. She built a cathedral in her mind and sat there instead. Other prisoners talked about her in hushed tones. Not with hatred. With reverence. She doesn't cry, one said. She prays for us, said another. They were waiting for her to break. She didn't. And the more she refused, the more furious they became. Because nothing enrages cruelty more than calm. They brought in a man, drunk, drooling, a minor noble who had betrayed his own brother for his freedom. They sat him outside her cell and told him to scream accusations. To spit venom. He called her a whore, a traitor, a witch. He recited lies until his voice cracked. She never looked at him. Not once. He was taken away weeping. Day by day, the guards began to fear her stillness. They started looking at her not as a prisoner, but as something else, something otherworldly. One said she walked like she wasn't touching the ground. Another said her eyes looked right through him. They hated her more for it. Because she reminded them of what they were not. And still, she refused. Refused to denounce the queen. Refused to sign the confession. Refused to weep in front of them. On the 9th day, they withheld food. On the 10th, they poured a bucket of waste over her head. On the 11th, they dragged her to a tribunal, but didn't question her. They stared. And sent her back. On the 12th, someone carved a cross into her cell door. And on the 13th day, they opened it for the last time. She looked up. And smiled. Not with joy. Not with arrogance. But with peace. Because she had survived what they thought would break her. She had faced madness and chosen grace. Faced violence and answered with silence. Faced death, and met it with open eyes. 13 days she starved, prayed, and refused to betray her friend. You've made it this far, are you really going to leave without subscribing to Tale of History? It began before dawn. Not with sunlight, but with a sound, low at first, like distant thunder. Then louder. Hooves. Boots. Wood dragged over stone. Metal striking metal. The city was already awake. Paris had not slept for weeks. There were no quiet hours anymore, only different kinds of screaming. But on September 3, 1792, there was a different electricity in the air, more precise, more choreographed. This was not chaos. This was something worse. This was intention. The mob had been fed words, lies, rage, by men who knew what they were doing. The revolution no longer needed truth. It needed spectacle. It needed symbols. It needed a bloodletting that could be seen from every window, whispered through every corridor, written in every newspaper. And they had chosen their offering. The gates of La Force opened like a mouth, swallowing the first wave of revolutionaries. They didn't burst in with fire. They entered with purpose. Lists in hand. Names etched in ink. She was on all of them. She had woken early. She always did. Her prayers finished before the guards arrived. Her cell, still dark, still wet. But her face dry, composed, prepared. She heard the shouting grow closer. Metal scraping the floor. Keys turned in iron locks. One door at a time, the building emptied. Until only hers remained. They didn't touch her at first. That was not the plan. They ordered her to walk. And she did. Out into the prison courtyard where the sky was a color she'd never seen before. Gray, but trembling. The makeshift tribunal sat behind a wooden table, 3 men, drunk on sweat and power, dressed like executioners pretending to be judges. There were no robes. No gavels. No oaths. Only one question. Will you denounce the Queen? She looked at them. Slowly. With neither contempt nor fear. She said no. Not with defiance. Not with pride. Just no. Then silence. A long one. And then, laughter. They had expected drama. Pleading. Maybe a trembling lip. Maybe a single tear. But she had given them nothing. So they made her an example. She was dragged to the outer gates. The mob was waiting there, pressing against the bars like animals smelling blood. The doors were opened. And she was thrown to them. They did not kill her quickly. Because this was not about death. This was about message. This was theater. A stage soaked in mud and piss and wine. And she was the leading role. They tore her gown first, every stitch, every thread, pulled apart by hands that shook not from rage but from joy. Her underdress followed. Then her body was exposed to the crowd like an artifact, like a cursed relic too dangerous to look at, too sacred not to destroy. She was pushed to her knees. Someone struck her from behind. She fell. Someone else pulled her hair. Another held her jaw. Then came the fists. The boots. The glass. They didn't kill her. Not yet. Because first, they raped her. In the street. In front of the children who had climbed barrels to watch. In front of women who had once marched for bread. Not out of lust. Not out of desire. But because they wanted to erase her. To make her unholy. She did not scream. Some say she whispered a prayer. Others say she sang. No one agrees on the words. But all agree she never begged. And when they tired of using her, they finished it. One man lifted a broken saber and drove it through her abdomen. Another brought down a club on her skull. Someone else pulled a blade across her throat. Her body collapsed, still trembling. They cheered. Then came the knives. They carved her open. They cut her breasts. They pulled her limbs apart like rotten branches. They reached inside her as if searching for proof she was not divine. And then, finally, her head. A boy, no older than 15, raised it by the hair. Blood ran down his arm. He didn't notice. Or didn't care. Someone brought out a pike. And the head was placed upon it. Not roughly. Gently. Then rouge was applied to the cheeks. Her hair was combed. Her lips painted red. The crowd admired their work. And when it was ready, they marched. Singing. Toward the temple. Toward the queen. Carrying not a message, but a mirror. Because when Marie Antoinette looked out that window, when the guards forced her to see what had become of her dearest friend, she wasn't looking at a head. She was looking at herself. This was the revolution's masterpiece. Not just a killing. A demonstration. A punishment for loyalty. A warning etched in blood and bone and silence. And still, after everything, no one could say she broke. She met her death exactly as she had lived. Still. Undefiled by fear. They stripped her body, but they could not take her final dignity, her refusal. One word. No. That was all she gave them. And it destroyed them. Because brutality cannot stand before grace. And mobs cannot tolerate mirrors. You have watched her dragged, beaten, mutilated. You have followed every footstep to this moment. And if you feel horror, good. If you feel rage, better. But if you feel nothing, then perhaps the pike was meant for more than just a queen's gaze. Perhaps it was meant for all of us. She stood alone. She died screaming no one's name but the queen's. You've heard it. You've seen it. You've stayed. So now I ask you, are you really going to leave without subscribing to Tale of History? They didn't leave her where she fell. That would have been mercy. And mercy had long been bled dry from the gutters of Paris. They had her head. But now they needed something more. A performance. The body was discarded, left in pieces, soaked into the stones like spilled wine. But the head, they kept. Handled it. Washed it. Arranged it. They brought out a basin. They combed her hair back into its perfect shape, curling the strands as she once had done herself in front of Versailles mirrors. They dipped a rag in rouge and dabbed her cheeks until the color looked almost human again. They applied lipstick. Carefully. Not with mockery, but with something colder, deliberate intent. She was no longer a person. She was now a symbol sculpted by vengeance. A grotesque parody of beauty. A woman painted not for court, but for horror. And when they had finished their work, they raised her head higher on the pike, twisting it just so that one eye seemed to open more than the other. So she could see. So she could watch. And then they marched. Through the streets of Paris, chanting. Not for bread. Not for freedom. But for spectacle. It was a parade of madness. Not the unhinged chaos of the wild, but the cold, orchestrated insanity of men who had planned each step as though they were staging a ballet. From tavern to square, from alley to avenue, the mob grew larger. More faces. More hands raised in salute. More children lifted onto shoulders to see the head of the Queen's witch. At every stop, they paused, lifted the pike, displayed her like a relic. Some laughed. Some stared. Some crossed themselves. But none looked away. When they reached the temple tower, the crowd grew quiet. As if even the mob could feel the weight of what they were about to do. Inside those walls, behind locked doors and iron bars, Marie Antoinette waited. Not as a queen. Not even as a woman. But as a prisoner. A mother. A widow. Grief had already gnawed its way into her face. The loss of status, of home, of future, all written in the lines beneath her eyes. But this? This was something worse. The guards hesitated. The mob did not. They demanded she be made to look. They shouted. Threatened. Beat on the doors with fists and musket butts. Some called for her blood, but not yet, not until she saw. At last, the command was given. She was told to rise. To walk to the window. To bear witness. She refused. They insisted. She fell to her knees. They dragged her. And when she stood behind the iron bars of her cell window, the crowd below erupted in triumph. They lifted the pike high, so she would see every detail. The rouge. The curled hair. The painted mouth. The mouth that had once whispered comfort in Versailles. Marie Antoinette gasped. Not like a queen. Like a mother. Like a woman watching her own heart impaled before her. And then, silence. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply collapsed. Her body crumpled into the stone floor of the prison. Her head struck the wall. And still the mob screamed her name. Not in worship. Not in anger. But in victory. Because they hadn't just taken her friend. They had taken her sanity. Her peace. Her past. This was never about punishment. It was about destruction. And they knew, no blade, no prison, no law, could wound the queen more deeply than this. Because in that moment, Marie Antoinette saw her future. And it ended the same way. They did it to crush the queen's soul. What will you do with yours? Hit subscribe. Or go cry in the comments explaining why you won't. They thought it would end there. A head on a pike. A queen on her knees. A city drunk on blood and victory. But Paris had windows. And the world was watching. The story spread like rot through the velvet halls of Europe. Not as rumor, but as fact, sealed with ink, bound with horror. It began in Vienna, where whispers slithered beneath the chandeliers of Schönbrunn Palace. The court stiffened. Servants stood still. The emperor's sister had just been forced to look upon the mutilated remains of her dearest friend. And then it reached London. British newspapers did not censor the details. They printed them in full. Front page. Illustrated. Line by line. Royal favorite raped and beheaded in Paris. Mob dances with head of Queen's companion. Revolution turns savage. France devours her daughters. Edmund Burke, the conservative philosopher, the man who once flirted with revolutionary hope, read the account in stunned silence. When he spoke, his voice shook. The age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. It was not the death that horrified him. It was the intention. Because this was not a crime of passion. This was a message. Sent not just to the Queen, but to every crown in Europe. You are not safe. Your women are not sacred. Your bloodlines are not holy. From Prussia to Portugal, thrones trembled. Not because one aristocrat had died, but because of how she died. Because the mob had enjoyed it. Because it had been choreographed. Because it had worked. And when the Pope heard, he said nothing publicly. But Vatican candles burned for 3 days. Masses were held in silence. And beneath the robes, hands clenched tighter. This was not just murder. This was desecration. And desecration demands response. In back rooms and war councils, the wheels began to turn. Austria could no longer ignore its daughter. Britain could no longer pretend to be amused by revolutionary theater. Spain, Prussia, Holland, they all stared into the abyss and saw themselves. If it could happen to her, a royal servant. A woman of grace. A widow who never lifted a sword, then none were safe. The first coalition formed not with fanfare, but with dread. Letters signed in candlelight. Troops moved in silence. Maps unrolled with shaking fingers. And across the channel, a chilling calculation was made: France must be stopped before she teaches the world to kill its own gods. The revolution had made its point. Too well. And the world recoiled. Not because it had a moral compass, but because it saw a reflection. And it was afraid. They wanted liberty. They expected chaos. But they had not expected this. They had not expected a woman's decapitated head to become the flag of a movement. They had not expected virtue to be rewritten as vengeance. They had not expected Paris to become a performance of pain. And yet here it was. The most elegant courts in Europe now passed around the same story: a royal favorite stripped naked, violated in public, and offered as tribute to a weeping queen. And for the first time, even the most sympathetic voices turned cold. The revolution was no longer an idea. It was a beast. They saw it now. And they would answer. You've heard how one woman's death echoed through a continent. You've seen how silence from heaven shook the thrones of men. So what will you do? Because if they could weep in Vienna, if they could rage in London, if they could shudder in Rome, surely you can subscribe to tale of history. Or maybe just keep pretending none of this matters. That's fine. The pike waits for the indifferent, too. There was no procession. No black veils. No incense. No priest to speak the last words. Because there was no body to bury. She had been too thoroughly broken for that. What was left of her, if anything at all, was scattered across Paris like cursed relics. A boot dragged through the gutter. A shred of bodice nailed to a tavern wall. A blood-soaked lock of hair sold for coin. Some said her heart was cut out and thrown to the dogs. Others whispered it had been burned on a spit and eaten by the crowd. There is no proof. There never will be. Because the men who ordered her death did not want her remembered. Not as a woman. Not as a friend. And certainly not as a martyr. They understood the danger of memory. A grave could become a shrine. A tombstone could bear witness. A funeral could be the spark that lit another fire. And so, there was none. They carted away the remains under moonlight. No names. No records. No ashes preserved. She disappeared in pieces. Not just from the earth, but from the archives. Officially, she ceased to exist. No public record. No trial transcript. No final rites. Only silence. And yet, she endured. Not in bone. Not in stone. But in the places the mob could never reach. In the torn journal pages smuggled from her cell. In the letters Marie Antoinette had once hidden beneath her pillow. In the trembling voice of a chambermaid who swore she saw her smile, even as the cell door closed. They tried to make her vanish. But ghosts do not vanish. They linger. In paintings never finished. In prayers whispered by strangers. In stories told by mothers to daughters, she stood by her queen. She never betrayed her. Not even in the end. And that was the revolution's greatest failure. Because what they feared most, what they tried hardest to kill, was not her body. It was her meaning. They wanted her silence to be just that, a void. An absence. A nothing. But silence, when chosen, becomes power. And now, more than 2 centuries later, you are still here. Listening. Imagining. Feeling. She has no grave. But she has you. She has your attention. Your horror. Your grief. Your awe. And maybe, just maybe, your voice. You may think you are just watching a video. But what you are doing is older than that. You are witnessing. And witnesses keep the dead alive. So say her name. Not because the records preserved it. But because you did. Because when they tried to erase her, they forgot something: you cannot kill loyalty. You cannot bury dignity. You cannot silence the truth forever. She stood against the worst the world had to offer. And she did not fall on her knees. She rose. And bled. And disappeared. But not into nothing. Into memory. And now, that memory is yours. They tried to erase her. But you're still here. Watching. Feeling. Say her name in the comments. Subscribe if you believe she deserves to be remembered. The revolution swore it fought for liberty. For justice. For equality. But when the blades began to fall, it was the women who were stripped first. Of dignity. Of humanity. Of voice. And they were not executed like men. They were displayed. Publicly. Spectacularly. Their deaths were not just sentences, they were lessons. Warnings. This is what happens when a woman thinks she can speak. This is what happens when a woman loves too deeply. This is what happens when a woman steps out of place. Princess de Lamballe wasn't the first. And she would not be the last. Madame Roland was next, a political intellect, a revolutionary in her own right. She did not flinch at the blade. She walked to it herself. And when they told her to kneel, she looked at the Statue of Liberty and said, "O Liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" Then came Olympe de Gouges, a playwright. A woman who dared to pen the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. They called her hysterical. They mocked her. And when they dragged her to the guillotine, they paraded her manuscript beside her like contraband. They didn't just kill her. They killed her ideas. And then, Marie Antoinette. Not the queen. Not the monarch. But the mother. The widow. The woman who had lost her child, who had been forced to witness her friend's head on a pike, who had lived through the starvation, the humiliation, the loss of everything she once ruled. When her turn came, they cut her hair short so the blade could find her neck. They bound her hands so she wouldn't lift her skirt modestly as she climbed the scaffold. They wanted her humiliated even in death. They cheered when the blade dropped. Because it wasn't just justice. It was vengeance against femininity itself. And what they did to Princess de Lamballe, that was not punishment. That was a performance. A message painted in blood and shame and silence: this is what happens to women who are loyal. To women who are intelligent. To women who are visible. Her body was not just violated. It was sculpted into a warning. She wasn't allowed to die with dignity. Because dignity was what they feared most. They used rape as punctuation. Terror as a sermon. And every woman dragged through the streets, every pair of breasts cut from the body, every womb desecrated, wasn't a crime of passion. It was a strategy. To silence half the population through fear. Because no matter how many rights were demanded, no matter how loudly liberté, égalité, fraternité was shouted from the rooftops, it was only meant for men. Women were given the blade, but never the banner. Their blood watered the soil of revolution, but their names were erased from its history books. Unless they bled publicly. Unless they died loudly. Unless they screamed for someone else. Then, and only then, were they remembered, as ghosts. As warnings. But never as heroes. And that is why you're still here. Because history is not just dates and deeds. It is who was allowed to speak, and who was silenced. And this story, this cruel, slow, deliberate massacre of women's dignity, was not justice. It was misogyny, dressed in the costume of revolution. And if your blood is not boiling, if your throat is not tightening, then you haven't been listening. Because they weren't just killing women. They were telling the survivors to shut up. To stay pretty. To stay quiet. To stay safe. Well. You've heard her story. You felt her breath before the blade. You've walked with her down the prison corridor. You've watched her erased. So now, raise your voice for hers. Comment her name. Share this memory. And if you believe women deserve more than the silence history left them, subscribe to Tale of History. Or stay quiet. Just like they wanted. 1789 began with a promise. Not of blood, but of balance. Not of vengeance, but of vision. The people rose up not to destroy, but to reclaim. To pull justice down from gilded balconies and plant it in the streets. Liberty. Equality. Fraternity. 3 words. 3 dreams. 3 oaths sworn beneath banners and broken bread. But by 1792, those dreams were ash. And liberty? Liberty had a knife pressed to her throat. It didn't happen all at once. Revolution rarely does. It shifted like fog, one execution, then another. One pamphlet more vicious than the last. One neighbor denounced. Then 10. And suddenly, ideals were no longer sacred. They were currency. You wanted to live. Say the right slogan. Wear the right color. Cheer loud enough when the blade dropped. It no longer mattered whether the accused were guilty. What mattered was that someone died. Because death was the theater the people demanded. The tribunals stopped asking questions. They began reading scripts. Enemy of the people. Traitor. Counter-revolutionary. Words emptied of meaning. Filled only with permission. Permission to kill. To humiliate. To burn the last pieces of what once made them human. What began as revolution had become spectacle. And the line between justice and madness blurred until there was no line at all. No trials. No appeals. No mercy. Just the sound of the crowd screaming louder with each drop of the guillotine. And behind every cheer, behind every laugh, there was something colder, fear. Because everyone knew, if you did not clap hard enough, you were next. Even the revolutionaries began to fall. Danton. Robespierre. The architects of the terror dragged to the same scaffold they once commanded. Devoured by their own creation. So was this still revolution? Or had it become something else entirely? An organism of violence, feeding on its own tail, ravenous for purity so impossible that even saints were torn apart to prove the point. The people no longer ruled. The mob did. A beast with no memory, no mercy, only appetite. And in its mouth, it held not justice, but names. Too many names. The princess. The playwright. The mother. The queen. The friend. The witness. Each one dragged from their homes, from their cells, from history. And made into a warning. Because in the end, that's what revolutions forget. Once justice becomes revenge, no one is safe. Not the innocent. Not the loyal. Not even the righteous. The fire burns everything. You've walked through that fire with her. You've seen what happens when ideals collapse under the weight of rage. You've watched liberty become a weapon. You've felt the sickness of it settle behind your ribs. So now I ask you, what do you believe? That justice still matters. That memory still matters. That some stories must be told, even if they turn your stomach to hear them. Then don't just watch. Don't just scroll. Stand witness. Subscribe to Tale of History. Because revolutions may forget. But you don't have to. She never held a sword. She never led an army. She never penned a manifesto or claimed a throne. She was not a queen. Not a general. Not a revolutionary. She was a woman. A friend. And yet, she endures. Not because of what she did, but because of what she refused to do. She would not lie. She would not flee. She would not bend. Not when the mobs howled. Not when the pike gleamed. Not when her name was spit through blood-stained teeth. She held the line, alone. Unarmed. Unthanked. They gave her 13 days in a prison of filth and screams. She gave them silence. They offered her life in exchange for betrayal. She chose death. And in the centuries that followed, historians tried to categorize her. Some said she was naive. Some said she was vain. Some said she was just another casualty of politics. But none of that explains what you've just seen. None of that explains the stillness with which she faced the void. Because she could have survived. All she had to do was speak. Renounce the Queen. Give them a quote, a lie, a sentence they could print and wave like a flag. She refused. And in that refusal, she became something far more enduring than a title. She became proof. That dignity is not a crown. It is a choice. Her letters, where they survived, are not political documents. They are quiet things. Filled with affection, restraint, private devotions. Testaments not to power, but to character. There is no manifesto in her handwriting. Only small truths. She was not built for revolution. But she was built to stand. And that's what she did. When the city collapsed, when the palace crumbled, when her body was torn from itself, she stood. Until the very last breath. Her story is not one of triumph. Not in the traditional sense. There was no rescue. No justice. No grand moment where right prevailed. But that is exactly why she matters. Because in a world that demands noise, she answered with silence. In a world that rewarded betrayal, she gave loyalty. In a world that consumed women, she left a scar so deep they're still trying to write her out of the story. But they can't. Because history may forget the names of kings, but it remembers the ones who bled for love. And she bled, not for glory, not for fame, but for a friend. No monument stands in her honor. No great novel tells her tale. But you're here. And you've listened. And that, too, is legacy. Because every time her name is spoken, every time her story is remembered, she rises again. Not in vengeance. But in quiet defiance. Proof that there is power in stillness. Strength in gentleness. And holiness in not surrendering to the madness around you. Princess de Lamballe was not history's conqueror. She was its conscience. A warning. And a light. And now she belongs to you. Carry her carefully. Speak of her rightly. And never, ever, let them tell you she was forgettable. If you've made it this far, you already know, she is unforgettable. Say her name. Keep it lit. And if you haven't subscribed to Tale of History yet, ask yourself this: if loyalty like hers is rare, why wouldn't you fight to keep it alive? Subscribe now. And carry her forward. There it is again. The pike. The blood. The painted lips. But now, you know her. You know the name behind the face. You know the voice that never raised itself, the hands that never struck, the heart that never turned. It's no longer just a gruesome image paraded through the streets of Paris. It's not just an artifact of horror. It's her. Princess de Lamballe. A woman. A friend. A soul who could have chosen safety. Who could have fled, who could have signed a lie, who could have whispered betrayal behind the stone walls of La Force. But she didn't. She stood when standing meant death. And now her head is back in your gaze, but not as a spectacle, as a mirror. Because that pike doesn't just carry her story. It carries yours. What would you have done? Not in the easy comfort of hindsight. Not with the distance of centuries. But there. In the moment. With the gates locked. With the mob screaming. With the air so thick with blood you could taste iron in your breath. Would you have stayed? When the queen was no longer a crown, just a condemned woman shaking in her cell. Would you have stood beside her? Would you have gone into that prison and said, "No, I will not betray her"? Would you have met the tribunal with silence, knowing what they'd do to you? Or would you have lowered your head, muttered something soft, "Survived"? There is no judgment here. Only the question. Because that is the power of her legacy, she makes you ask. Ask what you value. Ask what loyalty means. Ask what kind of courage you carry inside you when no one is watching. We are all watching the same pike. But we are not all watching it the same way. Some will look and turn away. Some will forget. Some will call it madness, or weakness, or unnecessary devotion. But you stayed. You listened. And if her story has haunted you, if her name has rooted itself somewhere deep in your chest, then she has not been erased. She has been reborn. Through you. So let that pike remain in your memory. Let that face rise again, not in horror, but in honor. And before you close this window, before you scroll away, ask yourself one last time, would you have stayed? And if the answer is yes, subscribe to Tale of History. Because the world forgets women like her. Unless someone like you refuses to. This isn't just history. It's the echo of a scream that never got justice. It's the sound of loyalty, ripped from a woman's body, yet never from her soul. It's not a story we told to entertain you. It's a story we told because it had to be remembered. Because behind that pike was not a symbol. It was a friend. A woman. A witness to love that refused to break, even when every bone in her body did. You've seen her horror. You've walked through her silence. You felt the weight of history press against your chest, not as dust, but as breath. So now we ask you, don't scroll past this moment. Don't let her name be swallowed by algorithms and apathy. Subscribe to Tale of History. Share her story. Carry her forward. And if you won't, don't hide. Don't vanish into silence like they wanted her to. Go to the comments. Say why. Because if she could face the mob, if she could walk to that cell and whisper, "I will not betray her," then you can face this. This is Tale of History. And this was Princess de Lamballe. Now, what will you do with her name?